We're in Quad Studios in New York City with some fantastic guys here that are hip hop lovers and legends. Would you please introduce yourselves?
How you doing? My name is Reggie Peters. I'm the Director of Marketing and Visitor Services for the Hip Hop Museum.
Eric Orr. I am the artist in residence and a gift shop manager for the Hip Hop Museum.
Elai Tubo, most people know me as Eli. From Eric B. and Rock Cameo, Eli Turn Up the Bass. From Paid in Full, I've been a recording engineer, a record producer from back in the 80s. Currently, I'm working with the museum as the audio curator of sound, and that goes from anything from transferring some of the classics from tape to digital, deciding what the sound of a museum is going to sound like, because a museum is different than a hip-hop museum. So you want people to experience it, whether it be virtually or whether it be in the actual space. So designing the exhibits, what type of sound system is going to go in there, all those type of things is part of what, curating the sound, making sure that it's classic, authentic, and quality.
Which I think is probably a very good space to start, because what makes a hip hop museum, and we'll go back into the history of hip hop and your experiences in it and how you guys got to know each other, but what is a hip hop museum compared to a regular museum?
Wow, I don't know if that's a loaded question.
I didn't mean it to
It's a museum. It's a place for ephemeral artifacts, and what I like to, and he spoke about it before, this museum is about accuracy. That's the big thing about this particular museum. It's going to be accurate.
So a lot of work has gone into it to create.
Well, when you're building something that you know is going to outlive you, then you have a different perspective. So we're not just thinking about building something today that we're going to see. We're talking about 5, 6, 7 generations down the line. So we're building a museum, and we have to think about technology that hasn't even been invented yet.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there is a difference between a museum that has a hip hop exhibit and a hip hop museum.
Exactly.
Because it's the same as going to a party. You don't want to go to a party and just be reading the flyers on the wall. You don't want to be reading, you want to actually experience what it is when you go to the party. So there's sight, hearing, taste, smell, touch, which is the 5 senses.
Yep.
We want to make sure that you have a hip hop experience, whether that's virtual.
That's a good one.
Exactly. Whether it's virtual or whether it's actually in a certain type of space that we're not just talking about what was done in the past, but we're building a home for hip hop that's based in the Bronx that the entire world will have to relate to, because hip hop has grown. New York, the Bronx, the United States. And so it gets back into what is actually hip hop so that it relates to the world.
We have zero competition, because what we're talking about is still living and breathing and growing and developing now.
Because it hasn't been done before.
The beginning of the story is still alive. We still have people that can give us first-hand information about what happened, who did what, who was there. The who, what, where, when, why, and how is still living and breathing. So even though we're telling history, it's really contemporary history. So we have first-hand account. And we're in the birthplace of hip-hop, where it all started. So just the significance of the location draws the pioneers from the very beginning to be very supportive. So, what started out as a small vision in the Bronx and grew into a global vision.
Yeah.
We are at the apex of that by having this location in the South Bronx.
What kind of support have you had from the artist side, producer side? What kind of love has been given there? A lot, I'd imagine. And how does that span?
We got Eli.
We've got Eli. We definitely got Eli.
I do think that what he was saying is that this has never really been done before.
Yeah.
So even if you were asked a question, what is the future of hip hop? What does it look like? That question, we could actually say we have to relate to the new artists, but also we're the future of hip hop too. The pioneers are actually the future of hip hop because we're actually building a museum that has never been built before.
Yeah.
So our relationship to, you could use someone like an example like Busta Rhymes and him passing the baton to the young lady that's saying, hey, girls as players too. Right. And the way they're interacting, that's hip hop. So it's not just, like they say, it's not a mausoleum, a place that talks about what hip hop was and goes to die.
Yeah.
It's an actual museum.
It's a living, breathing
and
thing.
And that's the exciting part about it, because you're getting the input from the pioneers that are still relevant, and then you have the young people who are going to feel that this is our home too. And then we're discovering exactly new technology. We're discovering genres of hip hop that didn't exist years ago. So it's a very exciting time.
So the genres of hip hop in itself, that is something that I've been trying to get my head around, and the evolution is incredible and vast, isn't it? Is there a way to summarize what those genres are and how they have evolved? From, if you think about, I know it's not a bit, this like how long is a piece of string maybe, but when hip hop began and where it is now, how relevant it is now, how popular it is now, it's almost like a tree. It's got extra branches now,
Right.
And I'd love you to try and break down a few of those for me.
In the very beginning, you got to remember the culture started with very young men and women
Yeah.
who wasn't educated in sound design, lyrics, and all those kinds of things. So when it started to happen, the birth, you just had young folks having fun doing what they love, not knowing that it needed a label to say, okay, so that's that type of hip hop, and now it's going to turn into this type of hip hop. If that makes any sense.
Yes. Yeah.
It's just in the beginning, kids having fun, and then other entities started to come in, and that's when things started to get labeled. And I'm talking from the visual art side, because as the resident artist,
Yes.
one of the pioneers of the graffiti movement, it was never called graffiti. It was always writing. We wrote our names everywhere. It was someone else that came in, saw what we're doing and loved what we're doing, and then labeled it graffiti. But let's stay on the sonic side of things.
But that's very relevant, right?
The entire hip hop scope of music in the beginning, right, was like an extension or from the backdrop of African American music in general, right? So what was basically playing in the black homes was what was used in the beginning to create what we call hip hop music, right? That's when the expertise was the turntable. How the DJ manipulated the record to get someone with a vocal to speak over it, right? So that started with basically R&B, soul, funk, rock, and then DJs, because they were unique, always had their own variety of records that they called their collection. That may be something a little bit more obscure, something a little poppy, something a little rocky, something a little new wave, something different that they will play and blend in with the traditional African American and Latino rhythmic kind of music, right?
Yeah.
Now, once we got to recording, the whole idea was, how do we recreate what happens in the party? How do we get that on wax, right? So they had these session musicians go in and replay what we call breakbeats, right? Which gave them original compositions of remakes, right?
Yeah.
So most of the first records was basically recorded with a band, with a session band.
That's mad,
Right?
Yeah.
I remember in those days in the studio, a lot of studios didn't even want you to bring turntables in there.
Yeah.
They thought
Really?
it was going to mess up their equipment. Right? I come from the era of studio recording where you brought stuff to the studio to work with. The studio may have to rent something for you, or they may have to borrow something from another studio, or you just had to bring in whatever your equipment was that you wanted to record from, right? So the turntables was in the party, but they weren't on the records. You might hear a scratch, but it was basically house bands playing over R&B and jazz and Latin or whatever music to create the first wave of records. Then, as we evolved, drum machines started to come into play.
Yeah.
Recording got a little bit more sophisticated. So now you're getting programmed records. You're getting records of people programming drum sounds themselves. And it was basically just a drum pattern and maybe a bass line. There was no orchestration yet. There was no chord structure. There was no key signature. It was just basically somebody patting a beat and somebody talking for 4 minutes. Right?
Yeah.
So now you evolve a little bit more.
He makes it sound a lot easier than it really is.
Right. You evolve a little bit more, right?
I just want you to know. There was genius there, Reggie.
It's genius all the way through. No, it's genius all the way through.
But I get what you're saying.
Right? So now you evolve a little bit more, right? Now real musicians are starting to see that there's a career path here, right?
Yeah.
So now you start getting people that understand key signatures.
Yeah.
They understand chord structures. They understand harmonies, melodies, choruses, right? And you're getting more of a song structure now. This is going like the late 80s.
That is,
early
you're
90s.
explaining the evolution really, really well. So then, sonically, it was pretty sublime then. So you're talking about real bands tracking onto Orange with real drum kits you're talking about as well.
Right.
And then what happened was those drum kits were sampled
Right.
and then they became on everyone's pads.
Well,
Was it not quite as simple as that?
I mean, everything he said, he said.
Yeah.
Being a recording engineer, I can break it down a little bit better to make sense. So you have to remember that this is New York City. And so there's a sociology behind hip hop that has to be taken into consideration. And that is that the arts program in New York City schools, they were cutting the funding for that. So you had a generation of kids before that we had to take music class. We had to take, and you
Instruments or
take your
something,
instruments
yeah.
home and
And
things
where
like
would
that.
what year would this be?
This was
roughly?
like in the 70s.
Mid
Late
70s to
mid-70s, right.
mid 80s.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
And then
Right.
when they cut the funding, what
Yeah.
happens is you had a whole generation of children that didn't have the benefit of music class, like they were saying. But the thing is that George Clinton says that the DNA of hip hop is R&B, rhythm and blues. Okay, so at that time, black engineers were starting to come out the recording studios.
Yeah.
Okay, and these engineers were actually the producers for the first hip hop guys that were doing the bands and things like that, because they were trying to recreate, as he said, the energies that was in the club, in the parks, in the streets, or whatever. So when these young guys were coming to the studio, they didn't know how to make records, but at that time we were being mentored by some brilliant R&B producers. A lot of people don't know that the Eric B. and Rakim album, the initial engineer for that album was Patrick Adams. Patrick Adams did a lot of disco records like Push Push in the Bush and all those disco records back in the day, but he was prolific enough so that he understood hip hop and what it should be, and that he was able to understand sampling and technology and all those other things, so that you have somebody that was a disco producer that was also producing one of the most classic R&B, hip hop albums of all time, which is the Paid in Full album. He was my mentor, and then he was too tired to finish the project, and then he called me in on the last two songs. But I think that the one thing that I do want to say is that the economics of it was really important, because technology always gave us a way to produce records to minimize the cost, because historically we didn't have a lot of money. So we was using the cheapest studios. We were using drum machines because you couldn't afford to have a whole band come in. Then it was sampling drum machines. Then it was turntables, and we were figuring out how to make music without the cost. And so that's why there's always a marriage between hip hop and technology, especially when it comes to doing music.
So that is the fact that a lot of people from the streets have been in love with this and have made this music. That is kind of the history.
Right, but it's also their genius too, because even though they took the music programs out of the schools. A lot of their parents were musicians too.
Yeah.
And then a lot of times we were still listening to the radio. But make no mistake, there's a genius in the room, because you can't do what was done by accident.
No.
If you consistently do it, then somebody has to know what they would, what they were doing. And that's the part where I'm saying it is part of the natural ability that we have, our spirituality, our expressing who we are. And that, I think that was another question that that was going to come up in terms of what was the most important music. But to see the young people, because you're talking about Run DMC, so we're talking about people that were 17 and 18. We're talking about MC Light, that was young. You're talking about Flavor Flav and Chuck D. You're talking about, when I'm giving you a roster of people that I've worked with, they were an average of 17, 18, 19, Run DMC, in that age. So the most talented children or people out of Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens, Manhattan, who some of them were from musical families, but some of them didn't have that, still had a certain sensibility that they could create. You put a kid in a room with the SP1200 drum machine, and you just leave him there, or you give it to him for a week or whatever, and by the time he'll come back, and all of a sudden he'll come something that's, and then as a result of that, back in the golden age of hip hop, you would be like, wow, did you hear what Pete Rock did? Or did you did that, and you start sampling and you start stepping from records, and because my definition of hip hop is sort of the ability to create something out of what appears to be nothing, and then to make what is ordinary, a frantic necessity or whatever. So the way these children were hearing that they could hear a James Brown record and take 2.5 seconds out of it, and then take that snare and then take it with this kick drum and put it there, and then flip this around, and all of that creativity is happening in their mind. And because of sampling, Project Studios developed, and continue what Reggie was talking about, that before you had to come to the studio and do that.
Yes.
But then once you had drum machines that you could take home, and you could, program it and figure it out, then they come to the studio with this, and play it, and then you just had to do the raps. And then after a while, they were buying their own studios, and with Pro Tools and digital things like that, the quality could be at your house.
Yeah.
So that's the part.
That's the growth.
That's the growth that he was talking about when he was talking about first you had to have a whole band and you were mimicking an R&B record.
Right.
Then, because
Even with sampling, right?
Yeah.
Sampling has a trajectory, because in the beginning, with sampling, the whole idea was you couldn't figure out what the sample was. It was this big secret. And that stemmed from the DJs before
Hide
them,
their records.
who used to hide their records or cover the label on the record. So even if you saw it on the turntable, you wouldn't know what the song was. You would only know that DJ played it, right? Every DJ had his own collection of that, right?
Yeah.
So when sampling began, that was the premise. To take something that you may recognize, but you really can't call it. And then when the business of sampling started to shape, and there was royalties that had to be paid, and licenses and permission and all of that, the sampling changed to, well, we might as well just take the whole record. There's no point in hiding where we got it from. Let's just dispose a portion of the record, give full credit, pay the original writer and publisher, and just get it out there.
Right.
So the creativity in it changed, because people like Pete Rock or
we had to grow
DJ
up.
Premier
We had to grow up.
or Q-Tip,
We had to
Yep.
grow up.
you never knew what was in their record collection, and you never knew where they got those sounds from,
Yeah.
right?
You had to start doing
But then when you
business.
think of people more like Jermaine Dupri or P. Diddy or Diddy or whatever, right? It was obvious where they got the record from, because they basically just remade the same exact record with different lyrics or a different chorus or whatever. So now, in today's generation, right, it's not even about sampling so much. It's about taking portions of things that work. This drum pattern works for this crowd, so I'm going to get it off of whatever platform, program it into my system, and add something to it. So they don't even have to basically make it in pieces.
Yeah.
They can take it in sections.
What about the messaging behind hip hop tracks? has that evolved, or has there always been a deep rooted? This is what we're
This way I'm
talking about.
gonna beat you up. I was waiting for this question.
Okay.
I was waiting. I was like, he's gonna do it. We have to look at it this way. Hip hop, for me, hip hop is a process. I have one foot in the unknown and one foot in technology to bring something. But if you look at hip hop as a process,
Yeah.
then it is a reflection of the human experience. Now, a lot of people get upset about what is expressed, but if you want somebody to express something that you're comfortable with, then make sure they have a better human experience. See?
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
So then that means that our youth are giving us a vision of the world that they see.
Exactly.
And so we're not in control of that.
Of course. Yeah.
You know, so then we have to sit back and look at the ride.
So it's an outlet.
It's an outlet for everybody.
Yes.
Because you still have people that are not willing to pass the torch. I liked your torch, but I ain't ready for the glue factory yet. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah,
right.
So that's why when somebody says the future of hip hop,
Yeah.
the future of hip hop is now being contributed by people that are older than me because of the museum and what it will be in hip hop. And we still have to have a relationship with the person that's expressing something, you know. So all the iterations of hip hop, whether, you know, we can't look at it and go, you know. Now technically,
Right. Yeah.
technically as an engineer, I can go, okay, these are the 5 things that I could tell you right now. That's going to make a competitive record.
Yeah.
It's going to have this. I can say that. And then I could say, and based on this list, that's crap. But at the same token, if that crap, you've got 1 million or 3 million people that are saying, I'm feeling that crap, then I have to sit back and go, okay.
Yeah.
Well, you know,
You have to
because
take that
my
one. Yeah,
because
take that
my
one in.
my
Yeah.
view has to get wider as opposed to saying this is my, because hip hop has actually outgrown him, me,
Yeah.
you,
Yeah.
or whatever.
Here's the thing about messaging, because that was the word you used,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Okay. Since the very beginning, once the rapper, I won't say the very beginning, because in the very beginning, it was about the DJ.
Yeah.
It wasn't even about a lyric.
Yeah, yeah.
Nobody cared what nobody had to say.
Yeah.
All you had was call and response. Throw your hands in the air. Say, oh, what's your birthday? You know. And nobody cared about that.
Yeah.
They came to hear the DJ play the music.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
And if you got lucky, there was some B-boys in there, you got a little bit of a show too.
Yeah.
Right? Okay, but now when we're talking about vocals and
Yes.
messaging, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
All of the messaging has always been there. It's always been diverse. It's just a matter of what's selling. What's selling is put into the forefront, and the other messages are kind of stifled. But from the beginning of time, there's always been a diverse community of artists that spoke from different perspectives. And it's still that way. It's just more platforms now, so you get access to more.
Right.
But in the beginning, there was gangsta, there was conscious, there was hustlers,
Yeah.
there was party,
Yeah.
there was crime, right?
Yeah.
There was the news broadcast, the storytelling. All of that was in the 70s.
It's kind of life, isn't it? Really.
Right.
You know.
But now what did they decide to put in the forefront is what we got used to.
And that had nothing to do with the kids that created the music. It was the ones that I told
Right,
you
it was
came
the
in,
businesses,
that
right.
came in, and then they started
That's
not
right.
dictating, but they controlled the outlet. So they
When
said,
hip hop was becoming a business.
So when
right?
you ask me about hip hop,
Yeah.
what I think about hip hop, I'm thinking about the person who's on the street that might be in an educational program,
Yeah.
who's writing lyrics that's just as competitive as anybody else.
Yep.
Then you're talking about, well, you're talking about the hip hop that they went into the studio and then maybe got a record deal. And then there the ones that didn't get a record deal, that's still brilliant. Then you got the ones that did get a record deal and then didn't get radio play. And then, so all of this hip hop you're not even relating to. You're relating to what I hear on the radio,
Yep.
which has to do with the politics
Yep.
and
It's
everything.
all about
And so,
what-
is that the future of hip hop? Are we judging it based on the people that had the amount of money to pay and shape it, or are we actually ears to the ground, looking at what's going on, saying the future of hip hop is bright because we're still creating And our generation, or no generation, has an exclusivity on creativity. None of us do. Because, if you look at Miles Davis, if you look at someone singing, they don't mean anything when they ain't got that swing. If you're looking at, whatever it is, creativity is still being expressed because that's part of the human condition. What hip hop did, which I love, is that we touched on something that was part of humanity. So that when we start saying, you know what, there was a revolution in an African country, and they were listening to hip hop for inspiration. Then you have somebody that's in New York deciding, I'm going to spit on my head, and then he gets a piece of cardboard and he's spinning on Times Square. Then I've seen some stuff that's come out of China and Russia, Japan. I could listen to the story of what's happening in London. Okay, and and I remember the first time I think it was this studio I was in here. It wasn't called this, but I remember the first time I was sitting in the studio and someone came in and said, you know what, everybody just went gold. And I remember going, wow, there are young people all around the world that like what I do. You see, then I realized that it's not just about me, it's about connecting to the human condition. Because when we're in a party, right, when we're in a party and that DJ throws that record on, nobody's going around and go, like this one. Now you're going to like it. It's going to be hot. No, it's like when that record hits and everybody goes, woo! How do they know to go to woo? How do they know to go woo? Because it's the people. You try to get, what is that energy in the party when people decide to come together and have a good time? And then can we translate that onto a record so that when I'm in the studio and because I've been DJing and I've seen the crowd rocking, and sometimes I've just gotten out and just stood in the middle of the floor and just absorbed it to go, this is hip hop. Some people think it's the turntable. Some people think it's the dancing, but it's just the way,
energy.
Right? It's just the energy that gets translated into knowing how to draw, called aerosol art, knowing how to b-boy, because music and dancing is basically the same thing. And so once you know that it's the people that know this, and you give the people a vehicle to express what they want, that's what hip hop.
I remember I was in Japan, maybe 1986 or 1987, and we were having a discussion like this about the sonic culture of hip hop, right? And I was trying to explain to them that you have to know what you're listening for when you listen to hip hop. That's lost in this generation. That's why everything sounds so flat or so condensed or compressed, right?
Crushed.
Right? Because when hip hop first started, it wasn't just listening to it from a holistic point of view where you heard everything. You were specifically listening to the bass. You were specifically listening to the drum. That was the driving momentum to everything else that the music was doing, right? So it's rhythm driven. It's rhythm, right? So now you take someone with a great voice, right? That just sounds good on drums and bass, right? Some great baritonic voice or whatever, right? Like a Melly Mel, right? Young body with a man's voice, right? It just carries through the speakers. That's what you have to know how to listen for when you're listening to hip hop even today. It's a little bit more difficult to really say, okay, I'm listening to the rhythm section. I'm listening to the bass line. I'm listening to that, what we call the break part, right? It's shied away to other parts of the music. Now it's all kind of sounds. It's all kind of auto-tunes. It's other things that they listen for to make them feel a certain way.
So it's not necessarily saying, I mean, obviously we could go really, if you wanted pristine sonics, obviously you want it to be coming in the ideal world through tape and analog and whatever else we might want to say. But I guess it's that evolution has meant that things like Pro Tools, which I know we're going to talk about a little bit, has had to manage that evolution and had to learn that digital was once horrendous. And it's a lot better now. Plug-ins are way better. Loudness war was another mad thing, wasn't it? And that was a huge thing. Maybe we should touch a little touch on that, because that's such, it's almost a rumor now, you know, when things were like literally eclipsed. It was insane. Whereas I'd imagine with when you're recording a band, there was much more dynamics left in there. I guess there was more headroom in those records initially, and now suddenly it went bang. So I'm sort of asking two things. But the first thing, do you remember what happened during the loudness wars in hip hop, and if you think that actually crushed the songs, the tracks more than it, or did it ruin the experience, or did people just want it to be louder in their headphones or on their speakers? That's the first bit I'll ask.
Well, the first thing is that with the loudness wars, we're learning as the technology changed.
Yeah, exactly.
So there were certain techniques that you had when you were dealing with analog tape, and one of them was that we discovered that there was natural tape compression on the team's tape.
Yeah.
As you're mixing it into as you make it into a master. So if you had a reel of Ampex 456 tape, and you would have it hitting, say, the 0 here.
Yeah.
We found that if you made it hit harder, that there would be a natural compression. The tape could actually take more signal, and we were trying to deal with signal to noise ratio.
Yes.
Now, what happens is as a technique, you started smacking the tape, and you were using your ears to decide whether it was good or not.
Yeah.
What happens is when Pro Tools started coming, a lot of us still had that type of mentality: smack it. And what happens is that the computers couldn't. You were getting what was digital distortion.
Yeah.
Because we didn't realize that that's not what you need to do with digital tape. And so what happens is that people were starting to know that you didn't have to go to a mastering lab. And with the mastering lab, they would even out all the different songs on the album, and then they would raise the volume. So what we were trying to do was we was trying to raise the volume as opposed to letting the mastering lab do that. And so that's where the loudness started. So a lot of people messed up because it was smashing. And the people at the mastering labs were saying, you're not giving us any headroom.
We can't do anything with it.
We can't do anything with it because it's like all right here. And we were looking at the VU meters and not understanding that the digital was different. And then after a while, you know, what Reggie's saying, because what's good about hip hop is that Reggie can have an opinion, and we're not all a monolith. I personally think that music sounds better and worse today. Okay, there was a commercial. Remember that commercial where the guy would be sitting in front of the speakers and you put it on, and then the wind would be blowing and his chair would be going back because it was so pristine and clear.
Right.
But we have a whole generation that doesn't buy sound systems in their houses. It's all in their headphones.
Yeah.
So their relationship to this here, they will never hear.
They'll never hear it. And of course, it's compressed and it's in various formats,
And
whether it
then
be
it's
MP3, MP4.
Exactly. And then you have people that are saying, I'm bypassing the system now because I'll master it myself. Or, you know what, I won't even master it, I'm just going to put it out. And so what happens is the parody is like this. It sounds really good, and it really sucks.
Yeah, it's so true. Yeah.
Right. So what's happening is that they have discovered certain things like the bass frequencies or some of these songs. We never did that back then, and it sounds incredible.
Yeah.
But then some of the vocals sound horrendous. Some of the things that are distorted. You don't have the mastery of the stereo imaging and all the things that we learned because nobody's teaching them, because there aren't any big studios that you can intern on and then develop the craft to know. People are doing this stuff in their house.
I kind of love the fact that you mentioned that the young kids, phenomenal explanation by the way, is that they were learning it, like you're saying, it was about the hip hop started from what you guys are telling me, is that from people that didn't have money to go into big studios, so they were having to do it themselves, going back to what you said a minute. So actually, in a sense, I kind of understand it in some ways. Like, it was about, we're going to do this on a cheap budget, on a small budget, and we're going to do our best with this. So there is kind of a nostalgic element to that in a way. I kind of love that art was created from as little as possible.
And we were trying to recreate what was in the clubs.
Exactly.
We didn't know, so we came in here and was like, nah, it needs more bass.
Yeah.
What happens is, right, Reggie?
Yes,
because
right.
what
That's
happens
right.
is first of all, because we weren't in the studio, and so our reference was the club. And when you look at the evolution of it, you have the DJs that were out there in the streets that were buying the systems like Disco Twins and things like that. So we started to know what excellent sound was. And then there was Power Play Studios and things like that worked out where people started to see the potential in terms of what hip hop was. And then it helped us discover the sound of what hip hop is going to be.
Well, here's the thing with engineers, like, that always seemed amazing to me, right? Especially throughout the 80s and the early 90s, right? Because that was when technology really was starting to make a difference in how we operated.
Yeah.
There was only a few studios that had contracts with major recording companies, right? So they had the state-of-the-art setups, comfortable lounges, pretty girls, great food,
Fruit bowls,
right? Entertainment on the side, right? So you had that studio experience, and you had the best tools to create a record, right? That's going to the same radio station that down the block. The studio may be a little more grungy, a little more analog, may not have all of the outboard gear. The mic might be choppy, right? But they still got to make that record sound just as good as the record that came out of this contracted studio, because it's going to the same radio station, and it's got to be similar quality, right? So there's a lot of small independent labels from the 70s and 80s that lost. They had great songs, and their artists were able to perform and do well. But they just didn't have the quality in the recording to stand the test of time to make it on the airwaves.
That's quite tragic, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah.
So, we've all heard the term digitally remastered, right? Some records needed more than that to be able to stand tall on the radio station in prime time.
I'd imagine some of the performances were still great. It's just a bit of a shame that they didn't capture.
Some people were so good at
sonically
performances that they never even really had a good studio career. Like the Cold Crush Brothers, for example, right?
Okay.
They're on every flyer, just about. Every flyer. To some degree. Special guest, featured, battle, something.
Right.
About 80% of the flyers that went around, they're on them, right? But if you look at their music catalog, it's thin. They couldn't translate that live entertainment feel to the level of recording. Not that they didn't record, but they did.
because I recorded their first
They
record.
did record.
Did you?
I did record.
Yeah, they recorded.
Yeah.
But to get to the level of play of somebody that's working in one of these bigger studios was the challenge.
The final bit I wanted to know was, when you've been recording in the studio many years ago, different setup, I'm assuming, something like it here. Tell me about your experience with the Augspurger guys and what they have done on their 25th anniversary, 50 years of hip hop. How influential have those guys been in not just hip hop but your career?
Well, let me piggyback off what Reggie was saying. We had to use what we had with the budget that we had, which meant that the studio and the quality of everything was not as good. I was actually in this studio here, and it looked differently, and it was a different set of speakers and monitors. So by me working at, say, Power Play and D&D studios, things like that, for me to get to Quad meant that I had to ride. The thing is that things became easier as we started using the equipment. But Augspurger, there's actually an elite now of artists that can actually afford that quality. And as a result of their relationship to bass, mid-range, and high, and being able to put it to the studio, what they've been able to do is they've been able to let the engineer and the artist fine-tune those frequencies that weren't really accessible, so that you can actually target it. Okay, because when we were mixing before, we didn't have subs in the studio. We didn't want it, because we were mixing on overtones and things like
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
Okay, and so what's happening is that it has evolved now that if you want to hear those below 60 hertz, 50 hertz, 40 hertz tones that have to match with each other, because if it doesn't, you're going to get all kind of low end distortion.
horrible,
Those are the things that were being filtered out.
Yeah.
We were going as low as 60 hertz back then. But what they've managed to do is that you can start hearing that they've actually mastered how to get those low frequencies in it so that they're not blowing out YouTube speakers, stuff like
Yeah,
that.
exactly.
So that's the brilliance in terms of this company and what they've managed to do. Not just that, because they still have the stereo imaging. The stereo imaging is important because that makes the difference between something that sounds like a well-produced demo
Yeah.
and something massive. So I can come in here and I can get in those speakers and do high-class R&B classical record as well.
Yeah.
But then the session that comes right after me will be like, and they can handle that.
Yeah.
Which is the brilliance of what this company is. So there should be some interesting things that should be happening in the future. I mean, hopefully we'll see, because you have the, Jay-Z bought these years ago. Drake bought these years ago. And so that's kind of like their standard. Maybe more people have access to it, and then you start seeing the quality of it. But that's one thing that this company has done for hip-hop.
Amazing.
As far as the museum goes, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get those early distortions and what's happening new to be authentic. Even if it was crap, you got to have it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense to go back there, remaster it, and walk in.
You need
in
that
here.
authenticity, absolutely.
Yeah.
And he said it was crap. I never said it's crap.
Well, I never said edit that.
I never said nobody's music is crap.
I'm just saying.
He
it's
said it.
distorted.
He said it.
But you want it to be authentic. So.
But it's part of the journey, and the thing is, that's what's the exciting thing about new companies like this, because back then we had to prove that hip hop was commercially viable.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we had radio stations that were telling us, "Don't bring that hip hop crap here."
we
and everything
didn't
was
have
like,
we didn't have to. I don't.
No. I mean,
we would do it
I
because we
remember-
loved it.
No, but, yeah, we loved it. But I'm saying in terms of
You mean
the
commercially?
culture moving forward, you had people like Ralph McDaniels that was doing videos because MTV would not play it. I had Frankie Crocker telling me, as a mixer, we don't want to hear that. They were trying to make a separation between what R&B music, what Michael Jackson was doing,
Right.
and even though Michael Jackson was doing the, the Thriller, and they was pop rock, and the Thriller, if you notice that was like telling our community, Michael was saying, Michael sees us. They you know what I'm saying?
yeah.
When you look at Thriller and you see them popping and you see the zombies popping,
yeah,
that was like being recognized or whatever. So it wasn't easy, but there was a point afterwards when you start getting into the 90s where the larger budgets were coming in, where you had Willie Puff Daddy back then, and those guys were actually starting to come into the studios, and you start to notice that the quality was getting higher.
R&B music, musicians, journalists, television, radio, celebrity hosts, they were very anti-hip-hop in the beginning. First of all, in their mind, it was cheap music. It was not really music because there was no singing.
Right. Yeah.
There was no harmonies. And a lot of it wasn't even in tune, right? So to people like Don Cornelius, who was like the godfather of the television show Soul Train, who really had the only platform for black music to be seen on a national level, right?
Right.
He refused to bring hip hop to Soul Train for a very, very long time because in his mind it wasn't in the tradition of the African American experience, and it was trendy and it wasn't gonna last.
Yeah.
Right.
So it took a long time for the elders, for the parents of the first generation of hip hop to really get on board with this as a creative music and a career path.
And we have to make sure that that's not what we're doing to the next generation.
Yeah.
We have to make sure, because as an engineer, I used to hear the jazz guys go, "Oh, that R&B stuff is crap." And then I would hear the R&B guys, "Oh, that hip hop stuff is crap." Well, you know what? That drum machine will never have the human feel. There's always a resistance to the claim. And whether it was rock and roll and Elvis couldn't shake his hips and stuff like that, there was always
There's always a resistance to change, isn't there?
Absolutely, and that's what it is. The resistance to change, not so much the music,
Yeah.
but the resistance to growth and change.
That's right, yeah.
Right.
You guys have been unreal. I could talk for hours with you. Thank you so much for spending time
Thank
with
you
us.
for having
Yeah,
us.
yeah.
If it means we come back to New York more and more, we do part 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 in the next few weeks.